It's remarkable how much the quality of the next installment in a franchise can absolutely plummet in response to, or in anticipation of, the criticisms of the lowest common denominator. The majority of most audiences cares more about accessibility and polish rather than creativity and, frankly, quality. And almost always rightly, we've begun to fear the detriment of everything we love that's getting a sequel. Metro Last Light was a game that gave me such feelings of hope and fear before it released, because even though its predecessor, Metro 2033, was a AAA title, it ended up having a very niche appeal. It was high-strung, punishing, and grim, and especially with the post-release Ranger Mode add-on, playing it well required practice. And while I can't say for certain what motivates 4A games, because to hell with research, I'd say it's very likely that the team made a lot of changes to Last Light's formula to appeal to a wider demographic. The sequel is definitely a very different, fairly more benevolent animal. However, though it feels less ambitious and more like a regular shooter, and that certainly is a bit of a shame, 4A has still managed to make a good, diverse game set in a fascinating world. The plot follows Artyom, the protagonist, as he sets off to apprehend a surviving Dark One, one of the remaining antagonists whom you try to destroy in 2033. Now that they're all gone, though, the last Dark One is seen as an objective good, and news appears to travel extremely fast in post-apocalypse Moscow, so you end up having to save the survivor from neo-Soviets who get to him first. 2033 had a pretty terrible narrative with bad writing and mostly forgettable characters, and Last Light definitely follows suit. But at the same time, it feels like it's missing something in the story department that its predecessor was still able to execute gracefully. I think Last Light is a lot more grandiose and convoluted, since its story takes place on a larger scale and tries to tackle politics. Despite its narrative shortcomings, 2033 treated war with a surprisingly great amount of respect, because whenever you were in conflict with other human beings, you were just trying to pass through their territory while they were busy with other matters. You were an insignificant observer, and you only really got to experience the harsh, well-developed cog-in-the-machine side of all the military stuff going on in the Metro. Now you're caught up in some big conflict between big factions, and the game shows more of the political side of war and lets all the demagogues give big speeches and execute prisoners in front of you and things like that. The problem is that the Metro games are so terribly written that it's all either laughable or boring. The first bad guy you encounter is a neo-Nazi who acts and sounds like an R-rated Colonel Klink with a terrible faked Russian accent, and the antagonists don't exactly get better from there. Roughly the first two-thirds of the campaign are about you or your friends getting captured by opposing factions, and the game just loves to make you the audience to overblown people making overblown statements that mostly fall flaccid. Aside from politics even, the narrative is filled with more cliches than all of 2033's Deus Ex Machina combined. As I mentioned before, the aliens you destroyed in the last game are good now, and even though they did hint at the idea that they weren't actually bad guys in 2033, their depiction was so shallow that their subsequent depiction in Last Light feels like the writer just wanted to retcon them in some attempt to reuse them and make them more interesting. The narrative also features other completely natural elements, like the betrayal of an underdeveloped character, some nonsense about being the chosen one, a literal magic sewer that solves all of life's problems, and even a character with breasts who shows up in 2 missions and then falls in love with you enough to let you grab her right breast as she shows you her left breast. With all of these problems, though, Last Light is still a feat of strength in terms of its world building. The cliches appear in cutscenes and set up the levels, but the levels themselves are just as intricately detailed as they were in 2033, full of visual backstory that shows a world much larger than just the rooms and ruins you pass through. You may be surrounded by idiots, but you're in an otherwise extremely well-designed world with functioning societies and ecosystems that derive their nature from real-world locations. For example, a station located beneath the remains of Bolshoi Theater is home to what remains of Moscow's performing arts community, and while your visit to the station is short, it shows such character in a way that few other games can. The game's narrative does have high points too. It's at its best when it adopts an approach to its narrative similar to what 2033 did, of course, meaning that sometimes it makes you insignificant and just treats you like an observer again instead of a big action hero. There's a particularly wonderfully executed subplot about a disease in part of the Metro, and it's actually interesting and makes sense. You don't go to the infected area with a brigade of AI companions who trigger a bunch of dumb scripted sequences. All you can do is pass through and take in what's happening, and despite the lack of direct involvement you have in this subplot, it turns out to be one of the most engaging parts of the entire game. The direction the story takes seems to reflect on how the game's design philosophy veers away from what made Metro 2033 really interesting in concept. The gunplay still poses a genuine challenge on higher difficulty levels, but the game doesn't ooze punishment as though you're just some guy who ends up having to go through hell to save the world. The original game's main survival mechanics have been neutered. Ammunition is much more plentiful, the bullet economy is easier to use, and gas mask filters provide a lot more time to breathe. The highly touted Ranger mode does limit how much ammo you can carry, and it gives you less health, but it feels more like just another difficulty level than something that truly changes the dynamics of the game. Even in Ranger mode, I ended up with 40 extra minutes of air near the end of the game, which would be like finding a chest full of diamonds in 2033. Expeditions to the surface were once harrowing experiences, and on my last playthrough in 2033's Ranger mode, I had to achieve a delicate balance between speed and safety before I ran out of ammo or breathable air. The fact that anybody can take his sweet time on the surface in Last Light without any sort of looming demise definitely hurts the experience. The stealth has also taken a big hit because now it's so stupidly easy. Metro 2033's stealth was something really interesting, and while the hive mind mentality of the AI ended up detracting from the experience, it was still a really tough mechanic that fit well with the game, because it was just as nasty to players as the shooting was. It was a game about taking risks and opportunities rather than playing consistently, and the stealth tended to be more about acquiring an advantage over the enemy before any conflict eventually broke out. Now the hive mind mentality is definitely gone, as enemies go on alert but don't immediately know where you are once one of them cries out, but any sense of danger is gone too. The people you can hide from are deaf-blind morons who can mostly be taken out one by one in a pretty obvious order. I'm not exaggerating when I say that the enemies in Last Light are some of the most unaware bad guys I've ever encountered in a game that allows for stealth. They don't pay attention to most noise or movement, and they turn blind as a bat when light is low, even though none of the game's environments are actually dark enough for the kind of vision loss they suffer. Their cone of vision must also be extremely low and not provoked as well, because they tend not to see you even in light unless they look directly toward you. The whole stealth system feels like a last-minute addition to a game that was going to be purely a first-person shooter. However, it's more likely that 4A Games tried to respond kindly to all the fucking babies who complained that they couldn't do pacifist ghost runs in 2033, because of course any game with stealth mechanics must allow for all clean stealth all the time. The result is stealth that is infinitely more viable and infinitely easier than starting a fight in any situation where it's allowed. While the stealth suffers because it's dumbed down though, the gunplay is similarly repurposed to play as something that more people are familiar with, but the changes made to its formula have actually led to a positive result. Like the stealth, it's no longer the slowly paced, tense experience that it was in Metro 2033, but instead of just becoming a boring shell of its former self, the shooting is a hell of a lot of fun. The AI, the environment design, the weapons, the sounds, and all the little details make the game a pleasure to play. I wouldn't call it a glorious shooter like Fear, for example, because you're fighting poorly trained teenagers and 20-somethings instead of cloned soldiers programmed specifically for combat, but fighting enemies certainly is satisfying. The human enemies are pretty smart, so they'll use proper cover, provide suppressive fire, and attempt to flank you, among other behaviors. And because most environments designed for gun combat have more than one level to them, enemies normally start off with the advantage and can end up doing a lot of damage on any of the difficulty levels that matter. Though because of this, the stealth can actually play a vital role in procuring an advantage before provoking anybody. Even though it's not nearly as lethal a game as 2033, some of the enemy encounters are still truly harrowing, and because of the enemy's behavior, even the most boring players can't focus their efforts on sticking to cover and waiting for their health to regenerate. The levels themselves aren't normally as open as the ones in 2033, but the combat environments are as great as ever. Both Metro games make surprisingly good use of the real-life environments the levels are based on, meaning that the long network of underground tunnels the campaign is set in is rarely used as an excuse to funnel you down one specific route during combat. Most human enemy encounters are set in natural-feeling arenas, with paths above and below them, and lots of large obstacles that facilitate flanking and getting enemies to lose track of you. Fortunately though, once combat starts, your opponents do become more aware, so sneaking up on them if they lose your position isn't nearly as easy as it is before they're alerted. The weapons are mostly carried over from Metro 2033, which is good, but the game also features some welcome additions to the arsenal. The A-Shot, a single-shot pistol that fires buckshot, is a personal favorite of mine, and some rifles and explosives also make a nice debut. Not all of the weapons are as loud as I think they should be, but they all have violent, meaty sounds and animations that make them feel absolutely deadly, and their impact on enemies is just as satisfying. The grenades and other explosives also deserve a mention, because their sound effect is more like a loud resonating bang rather than a normal cinematic explosion noise, and all the little details like that make combat feel more dirty than in most other shooters. Weapon trading has also been modified so that you can now purchase attachments for your weapons instead of just finding them lying around. In part, it's a good addition since it would be foolish not to sell useful items like silencers or rifle scopes, but it also puts a clear hierarchy on some of the weapons. For example, the Theadder and Helsing, two very useful silent pneumatic weapons from 2033, are now rendered redundant because they're less efficient and more costly than normal automatic rifles, and now you can get a silencer for pretty much any weapon at pretty much any station for a lower price, if your forsaken soul wants to go the stealth route. Similarly, I think I rarely even touched a bastard submachine gun, regardless of its attachments, because I always had something better constructed. I would have liked the attachment system a lot if it was more reserved, not necessarily because it would have made the game more like its predecessor, but because it could have made all the guns have their own reasonable uses. Some elements that are more faithfully executed in Last Light, though, are the monsters and surface expeditions, and in a few cases they're even better than they were in 2033. The mutants have had a roster update, although most are just recurring ones, but all the additions are definitely enjoyable. The first new enemy you'll encounter is something like a giant spider-scorpion hybrid that lives in the dark and is sensitive to light, and you have to shine your flashlight on it to reveal its weak spots. It's similar to the enemies in Alan Wake, but actually menacing. That said, it doesn't appear enough to become a great challenge or anything, but a few other new enemies that show up later on make similar use of natural exoskeletal armor and weak points, and they're much tougher. The game also uses some old mutants in more interesting, prominent ways, like the snouts that walk on walls and fire some kind of sonic attack at you, which only had a very small role in one or two scripted sequences in 2033. The first hour or so of the campaign has a habit of railroading you through its levels when you're in contact with an AI companion, and because of where it takes you, the above-ground segments at first look like they're going to suffer, because restricted linearity doesn't normally mix well with a dead cityscape. After the second short surface expedition, though, going through post-apocalypse Moscow is as fascinating as ever. There are still some corridor crawls through tiny crevices in parts of later levels, but Moscow is big, and the surface levels feel like natural environments overall. Last Light is set during a warmer season, so the environment has changed dramatically from a frozen wasteland to a murky wasteland, and its execution is just perfect. One level places you in a swamp as dusk approaches, with only the goal of reaching a church at the other side, and just leaves you to your own devices to find safe passages across bodies of water, to find everybody else's hidden stashes, and to survive against tough roaming wildlife. It's wide open, drop-dead gorgeous, and heavily atmospheric and challenging, and it's by far one of my favorite levels in a linear FPS. Other surface levels follow suit and provide similarly wonderful experiences. Last Light made plenty of changes to what made Metro 2033 a wonderful game, but in a way, it came out a game that I'd recommend because of its own new merits. The story was never good, and I doubt the books are much more interesting, but the second game finds ways to be more annoying than the first, and the stealth is just offensive. But weighed against how joyous the gunplay is, the story is just a backdrop, and the stealth, although it is a viable solution to a lot of enemy encounters, feels like a feint that isn't actually all that significant, like the crappy horror in a Fear game, or the so-called open world in Rage. Its major shortcomings have little effect on its far superior core gameplay. Something that is understandably off-putting, however, is the Ranger Mode DLC situation. After it was introduced, Ranger Mode had a huge impact on how I viewed 2033, and the people at THQ, and by extension Deep Silver, decided to capitalize on it. At least for PC, the original Ranger Mode add-on was released for free, and it was wonderful. Now, unless you pre-ordered the game, you have to pay $5 extra for Ranger Mode in Last Light. I'm not about to get preachy, that's for dumb shit YouTube comments that I'll probably receive. I just use my videos to judge things by their merit rather than their business practice. And the fact of the matter is that that kind of DLC is just not worth buying from my point of view. It might actually have been if Ranger Mode was as tough as it used to be, but as I mentioned earlier, it's basically just a moderately higher difficulty level with a few small restrictions in place. The highest difficulty in regular mode does provide a genuine challenge, so it's not like you're missing out if you don't get Ranger Mode, but Ranger does lend itself to a second or third playthrough. With that in mind, it is still sad that Ranger Mode isn't included with every copy of the game, but it will probably be worth purchasing once it all goes on sale. It's interesting to see how a game can move away from its source material's design philosophy and ultimately fail to deliver, which is what I thought I was in for the moment I tried Last Light's stealth. But it's conversely one of the most rewarding feelings when a game still manages to be something great, even if it lacks its former ambition. I began playing Last Light in the hopes that, like its predecessor, it would essentially fuck me in the ass, but it ended up showing me how other things that aren't nearly as painful can still provide joyful experiences.
Did you ever consider trying to the program?